My name is Katie Demali, and I'm a program director at the French American Foundation. Today's discussion will explore media polarization in the United States. And we're lucky to have with us our guest speaker, Amy Mitchell of the Pew Research Center, who will explain to us why Republicans and Democrats place their trust in two nearly polar opposite news media environments. And she will talk a lot about that and go deeper into that phenomenon. And first, I would like to introduce our moderator, Sewell Chan. Sewell is the editorial page editor at the Los Angeles Times. And as such, he oversees the editorial board and the op-ed and Sunday opinion pages. Sewell previously served as a deputy managing editor, overseeing foreign and national news coverage, the front page, the data and graphics department, the multi-platform copy desks, newsletters, and the editorial library. And before joining the LA Times in 2018, Sewell worked for 14 years at the New York Times. Sewell was named a French American Foundation Young Leader in 2009, which is how he's connected to the foundation. And Sewell, I will let you take it from here to introduce Amy and to begin the discussion. And I'll just note beforehand that for participants who have questions, please feel free to write them into the chat or the Q&A below, and we will hope to answer those questions. Thank you all for being with us. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you to the staff of the French American Foundation for bringing this about. I've been reflecting on how in the decade plus since I became involved with the French American Foundation community, so much has changed in our political and information landscape, and the pace of that change at times seems to be accelerating. There are few people better equipped to talk to us about changes in the journalism landscape than Amy S. Mitchell. She's the director of the Journalism Research Program at the Pew Research Center, overseeing research related to news and information, how the public accesses, engages with, and creates news, what news organizations are providing, and how technology is changing all of these elements. As someone who closely monitors developments in journalism, I can attest that Amy's research is one of the most important sources as we in the media are trying to understand and adapt to the changing information landscape. And with that, I would like Amy to begin with a presentation of some research she has done that report last year about media polarization in the U.S. Amy, do you want to take it from here for about 20 minutes, and then we'll engage in Q&A, first from me and then hopefully from the audience.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sewell, and to all of you for welcoming us to be a part of your day today and your conversation around these topics. It really has been quite an interesting time in the U.S. in particular in terms of political divides and how we've seen those political divides manifest themselves in people's choices for news sources, both in terms of where they're going for news and in their views and attitudes about the news in general. We just completed with a report that was released on Monday, actually, what was a year-plus long endeavor on a project called American News Pathways, which was looking at how those divides in sources and where people are turning for news sources interplays and connects to what they're seeing and hearing in the news and what their views are about the realities surrounding current events. It was really a fascinating project, and we were thrilled to be able to tie some of those things more closely together. So what I was going to share with you all today, at least to start off, is one of the first pieces of research that kicked off that project. That was a look at where are we today in terms of those divides, in terms of where Americans are turning for news, and particularly partisans, Republicans and Democrats. And that was sort of the launch of this project. It built off of something we did in 2014 that was our first real effort to explore how these political divides manifest themselves in people's news sources. And so we then built on that, and I will start by talking through some of those findings and then some other findings that came from this project, and I really look forward to the discussion. So please do share your questions in the chat, and thank you for letting me share with you. I'm going to share my screen here. And we will get started. So as I said, a lot of this is coming from, that this is start is a survey that we did in 2000, in the November of 2019, actually. So it was sort of just before we got into the full launch of the election season, and asked people about 30 different sort of sources that they might turn to for political news, or have turned to for political news in the past week. And this was these are very specific sources. So things like the New York Times or Fox News or Hannity, or BuzzFeed, or a number of sort of specific kinds of sources that people would turn to, as opposed to the platforms or the pathways, which we also ask about separately. And we asked about sort of if you're aware of these sources, if you've heard of them. Then we asked whether you trust them. If you didn't say you trusted them, we ask if you distrust them. And then we ask if you got news there in the past week. So a number of different sort of layers of understanding here. And one of the things that comes out very strongly, you can see here, this is asking about trust and distrust. And when you look at Democrats, among Democrats, they trust more than distrust 22 of these 30 sources. So the vast majority of the sources we asked about, Democrats express more trust in them than distrust. Among Republicans, the distrust far outweighs the trust. So Republicans distrust more than trust 20 of these sources. You almost see the near reverse in that trust and distrust measure. And it's important to think about the fact that it's not just not trusting, it's an actual distrust. And so when you look at some of the usage, you can see there are sources that people may come across, but they still had said they distrust them. And so that active distrust is sort of a higher level than just saying, well, I don't trust it. And these gray bars are about equally trusted and distrusted. And so then if we look at, that this is the percent who trust each of these sources. And so you can see, again, sort of large differences between Republicans and Democrats in the, not only sources themselves, but the number, right? Excuse me, sorry about that. That there's only one source here that more than half of Republicans said they trusted, and that was Fox News. And then you jump down to a third who say this of ABC. Among Democrats, there's just a much wider range. And this is something we saw, not quite to this extent, but also saw in our 2014 study, that there's just a wider range of outlets that Democrats and those who lean Democratic turn to and also say that they trust. And so you have your high here at CNN, which is about on par with the trust that Fox News has among Republicans, but also a number of these that have more than 50% of Democrats saying they trust them. And it's interesting to see that singular orientation around Fox News for Republicans. And if you look here at U.S. adults overall, you kind of see how this balances out. And then these two are the distrust numbers. So if you look specifically at the portion who distrust, you've got the one distrusted by the largest segment of Democrats is the one trusted by the largest segments of Republicans, and vice versa. And so there's definitely sort of a sense of the different sides here in terms of who you're trusting in. And there's actually not a single source that half or more of the American public says they trust. And that's a pretty incredible statistic if you think about it, that there's not one source that the majority of Americans agree on that they trust. The highest here is Fox News at 40%. And I'm sorry, this is distrust. And if you look back at trust, I wanted to make that point here, and that we have these numbers, but there's not a single source that half or more of Americans say they trust. And so this just sort of also looks at, where people have gone for news, and that singular reliance among Republicans on Fox News, and with Democrats turning most to CNN, but relying on many others as well. And then you see the way that balances out, if you're thinking about the country overall, is you have Fox News and CNN, pretty close to each other overall in usage, but that's largely divided along partisan lines. And so how this ends up playing out in, when you look at the audience makeup, of these outlets, and this is the way we think about outlets and specific sources and brands a lot, and the way we sometimes categorize them in our research is based on their audience profile. So the audience makeup, not necessarily, so it's about sort of what is the political makeup of the audience that goes to these. So if this is your average US adult, here in the middle, you end up seeing on this continuum line, these where their audiences lean to the right politically to a very large degree. So if you think about it as kind of a mountain, you end up having a very large segment of the audience here for Breitbart, Hannity, and Limbaugh on that right side of the political aisle. And you don't get quite as far down here, but you have it much, the higher portion of an audience on the left side of the political outlet, that higher mountain part here for Vox. And then you have a number that fall on this left side as well. Far fewer, that have an audience that leans to the right politically one way or another. And you'll see, so Fox News, even though it has that singular orientation, this takes into account your party and your ideology. And so you can see that there is also a large segment of US adults that are more in the middle that turn to Fox News as well. And so it does actually pull their audience makeup back a little bit more towards the middle than some of the other outlets. And this is if you look at so we also look at, so who were people in our survey, and the surveys that we did all had around 9,000 or more, so very large N sizes that are all done, online and with the fit our nationally representative. And so when you look at sort of among those 30 where they said they went, you have about 20% of each. 20% of Democrats and roughly 18% of Republicans who only named outlets that lean their way, whose audiences lean their way politically. So 20% of Democrats who turned only to outlets whose audiences lean to the left politically. 18% of Republicans who only turned to, among these 30, to outlets for political and election news whose audiences turned to the right politically. So you have sort of what you would call kind of the ends of that spectrum and the bubbles. And so it's also important to realize that there are a lot of non-traditional sources that play a role in people's information and news diets today, and in today's media divides. And so this was a question we asked about in terms of getting news about the coronavirus outbreak in the US. Among these, which do you rely on most? And you see you've got your largest segment there, say national news outlets, but that's 26%. Another 2 in 10 saying public health organizations and officials such as the CDC or the World Health Organization. Roughly same percentage that say that of local news outlets. And then you get down to a similar percentage that say this of Trump and the White House Coronavirus Task Force. And one of the things that we saw, and then a number of others that kind of make out the end, and one of the things we saw throughout this course of study was quite a difference when it came to the COVID-19 outbreak in what people were hearing and seeing in the news and their sense of the outbreak here in the US particularly, based on some of the places they turned for news, or at least connected to some of the places that they turned for news. In addition to the specific sources that people can turn to, there's also a choice about what pathway one is going to use to get their news. And we can see here that, again, lots of divides in what people say is the most common pathway they use to get political and election news. None that's over a quarter. So there's also a lot of separation in terms of how people are accessing and getting that news and information. And we see differences among them. And one of the interesting groups to look at are those that 18% who said that their most common way is through social media. And it's interesting because when you look at the folks who say they mostly turn to cable in particular, or you know, a couple of these others, they're pretty engaged. So they're following these news topics closely. They're paying a lot of attention. They're not, when we ask knowledge questions, their knowledge tends to be fairly high in some of these areas. When it comes to social media, one of the things that we see is they tend to be paying less attention, less close attention to a lot of current event topics in the news, such as the election or such as COVID-19, and to news in general. They're just less focused on news as their intake. And they're less certain about a number of things that may or may not have occurred, express less certainty when we ask a series of knowledge questions, both about current events and just about sort of our democratic structure in the US. And then we do see that they express less concern than many others about sort of the issue of misinformation and made up news, but do have higher exposure to certain kinds of threads or claims, either false claims or unproven claims that may have been around. And we also see when you look at sort of sources, but there's also that attitudinal sense, right? And the overall trust and distrust of specific sources is one of them, but it also carries through to attitudes about the news media more generally. And again, we've been seeing this. So when we did, we've been asking a number of sort of questions about people's views and attitudes towards the news media for a long time. And there have always been some partisan divides. Generally, Republicans in the US tend to be more skeptical of the news media than Democrats. But following the 2016 election, we saw those divides just really grow very, very dramatically. One of the questions that we have asked regularly for decades, and going back to when Ronald Reagan was president, is about sort of the watchdog role in the US, the watchdog role that journalists play in terms of keeping an eye on political leaders. Do people think that is a good thing because it keeps them from doing things they shouldn't? Or is it not a good thing because it gets in the way of these leaders being able to do their job? And generally, there's been quite strong support for the watchdog role in the US. There tends to be a little bit of difference based on who's in power, right? So if a Democrat's in office, they tend to be higher and more, they tend to question the watchdog role a little bit more, and vice versa. If there's a Republican leader, president in power, Republicans tend to be more questioning of the value of the watchdog role. But overall, pretty strong support. The biggest gap we had seen between the two parties in this question was a 20 percentage point gap back when Bush was president. And this following the 2016 election, we asked this question in early 2017, we were at over a 40 percentage point gap between the two, with both Democrats becoming more supportive of it and Republicans becoming far less supportive of it. And that gap, as we've asked this question since then, has just has remained as large, if not larger. So really dramatic increases following that 2016 election. And we continue to see this today. So sort of to give you a sense, we ask about a number of different questions that are sort of evaluations of the news media, and this is the percent who say news organizations. Do each of these things care about how good of a job they do? Only 28% of Republicans say they care about how good of a job they do, versus more than half that say they don't care. Are highly professional or not highly professional? Again, very large divides here. Protect democracy, the question about protecting democracy. Just 16% of Republicans who say that they feel that news organizations work to protect democracy as opposed to hurt democracy, versus 44% of Democrats who feel that way. Stand up for America. Again, wide divides, care about the people they report on. Very low here. That's the lowest margin among these questions for Republicans. And when you ask about sort of, the ethical standards of journalists, again, this is the percent who say that journalists have very low ethical standards. 31% of Republicans say that versus 5% of Democrats. And one of the other things we did in this particular project was we looked back over about roughly 10 years of data to really dig into what are the different factors that can play into an individual's level of trust or distrust for the news media, because we've seen the partisan divides, we've seen those, and we want to know what else might there be. Does age play a factor? You know, race, ethnicity, where you're living, you know, your income status, any of these other things. Nothing comes close to the divides that we see in partisanship when it comes to trust in the media. Nothing in our data came close to it. And then what we found among Republicans is really a big difference here, based on whether they approve or disapprove of the way Trump is handling his job as president. So, you know, a Trump approval versus a disapproval within the party. So among Republicans who strongly approve of the job Donald Trump was doing at this time, 40% said that journalists have very low, so not even somewhat low, but very low ethical standards. And then that continues to go down as support for Trump fell. And again, this is a question of this. Also, another thing that we looked at was sort of within party, in addition to the Trump resort, was also people who are highly politically aware, so are engaged, have high levels of knowledge, are following things closely. And you see here again, the largest difference occurs among those who are highly politically aware. So it's not just that people aren't paying attention and they sort of make these, have these views even if they're not really, you know, thinking too much about it. A 75 percentage point difference within party based on those who are highly politically aware. So Democrats who are highly politically aware, 91%, who say they have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence that journalists will act in the best interest of the public, falls to 16% among Republicans who are highly politically aware. So this is an engaged group. It's like that 20% that was in those bubbles tend to be very highly engaged in news and in the political process generally. And then this just shows if you compare sort of, well, are there divides everywhere? Are they just totally divided on everything? Well, not so much. So the highest gaps here occur. So this is a percent of Republicans and Republican leaders who say each group has very low ethical standards based on the job Trump is doing. So if you sort of put all these pieces together and you see where it stands out the most is when you ask about journalists. So that factor of both party and strong approval for former President Trump. You see very much less difference here, both in terms of the overall attitude being, you know, not as negative, but then also less difference based on Trump approval when you ask about a number of different professions. And then finally, I'm just going to end with one point, and I just put one example in here. But as I was saying earlier, one of the things we spent so much of our time studying over the course of this last year and project was about sort of how these choices for news, these divides, when we look at where people are turning for their news, intersect with what people are seeing, hearing, or what they believe about the realities. And we certainly saw over the course of you know, the two biggest storylines this year, lots of divides in people's sense of what was going on and what they believed. And if you look here, this is an example. If you look among Republicans, those who said that the Trump campaign was a major source of election news for them compared with other Republicans. So these are examples that we did within party, both based on media diet in terms of the specific sources and also the role of some of these non-traditional sources like the Trump campaign. 61% felt, and this was asked in September of 2020, so this was as we were just ramping up conversation about the mail-in ballot. But 61% who said that voter fraud is a major problem when it comes to voting by mail in U.S. presidential elections. And that falls almost in half among Republicans, still Republicans, but Republicans who did not say that Trump was a major source of political news, political and election news for them. So real differences there. And we see, you know, some other differences when we look within party based on the sources people are turning to in terms of those right-leaning or left-leaning audiences. You did not see the same sort of difference among Democrats who turned to the Biden campaign for news and those who didn't. I'm going to end there, and I will look forward to discussion and question. Thank you all very much.
Amy, thank you. There is so much territory to discuss here. I scarcely know where to begin. Really, really fantastic presentation. Let me start by asking about the future. With so much of the media polarization having accelerated in 2016 and after, do you think that there will be a kind of post-Trump return to pre-2016 means, or do you see the changes as being kind of lasting and irreversible?
Well, you know, it's one, it's hard to know, and two, we don't predict. So I can opt out of the actual prediction, but what I can say is that, you know, there is certainly, if you look within there, there was certainly a difference among Republicans, within Republicans, based on those who were turning to Trump for news and those who weren't. There are also just a lot of partisan divides in general in where people are going for their news. And when you look at sort of the wide range of sources and what continues to be an evolution, right, an additive kind of evolution of those sources and the places people can turn to, whether they're private online forums now, or, you know, even sort of moving beyond the social media part to the private, you know, media part, that there's such a wide range that we haven't seen any indication of a coming together. There could be, you know, there may be differences within the Republican Party sort of on, you know, Trump supporters and non-Trump supporters, et cetera. But when you look at that straight sort of the divisions of where people are turning and how that aligns with partisanship, we've not seen any indication of that sort of moving back. And in fact, if you compare that the 2020 data I was starting with in those trust and distrust numbers to the 2014 study that we did, a number of those sources we asked about in both. And what we saw, if anything, was a growing distrust among Republicans of a number of those sources, you know, including the Washington Post, the New York Times. And so there was actually a widening. So it'll be interesting to sort of, you know, and obviously it's something we'll continue to study, but there's not an indication of the country coming together, and instead we're getting wider and wider range of ways people can be informed and what they can rely on.
Yeah. Amy, I think we in the mainstream media, broadly speaking, you know, the institutions of mainstream media, including CNN, certainly including the legacy organizations like New York Times and Washington Post, really came to a position of, you know, prominence and greatness during this kind of post-war era of a strong American middle class, relatively less polarization. I'm talking about the 40s to the 70s here. And really, you know, speaking for myself, you know, I saw these institutions as being purveyors of a truth, not omniscient, but trying to really use fact-based methods, standards, ethical precepts to kind of, you know, tell truths. The ideological spectrum you outlined, though, suggests that how we're perceived is, of course, profoundly different. What can mainstream news organizations do to repair, enhance, develop, and foster trust in such a divided and fractured time?
One of the things that, you know, we did in addition to this Pathways project, one of the other year-long studies we did was around trust, and, you know, trying to get underneath it and understand it. And one of the things that we've seen is that desire for a sense of connection, for a feeling that, you know, the news organizations understand me. I see myself represented in that. When we did a large study of local news, it was that sense of connection from the journalists was dramatically tied to positive evaluations, right? A positive sense of the work journalists were doing and a sense of connection. We had about half say that most of the news they were getting at that time was coming from outside their own local area. So that, and that's at the local level. So, you see how that sense of a disconnection can manifest pretty quickly. So do I feel like I know? Have I ever spoken to a journalist? That number was around 21%, that said that they had ever spoken to a journalist. So again and again, that sense of connection, of trying to reach out, of trying to say, we understand you, seems to be something that the public responds, to very strongly.
Yeah, fascinating. Fox itself, of course, is now facing some challenges to its dominance from the right. One America network, Newsmax, and these kinds of alternate sources. Do you see a challenge of kind of Fox's dominance coming from these new alternative news sources, and of course the potential that Donald Trump himself might either seek to establish or invest in a kind of alternative right-wing media infrastructure?
Well, I don't have data on this, that we've gathered ourselves. We did ask about sort of where people were going for election news just after the election, and did not see a downtick on Fox among Republicans, and did not see a more negative assessment of Fox among Republicans. That said, that was very early after the election. We've certainly, other outside metrics show that rise, the surge in audience for Newsmax, and growth for OAN and as well. It'll be certainly something to watch, and is certainly something that we will be, looking to gather data on and understand as well. It's, as news sources emerge, there's certainly going to, be that, potential tension that arises. And I think it's sort of, at least in terms of our research, yet to be seen what impact, if any, that may have on Fox News in terms of that singular focus it has maintained among Republicans for so long.
Amy, this is, again, maybe a little bit more speculative, but could you tell us a little bit about the role of kind of media regulation and media support in shaping the American news landscape? Are we a nation that would be better off from having a BBC-style, nationally funded, public broadcasting network, perhaps by strengthening PBS or the NPR stations? Do we, how much of this crisis in trust and polarization is related to the broader economic and technological challenges facing news organizations, and also questions of media concentration, of course? I know that's kind of three big buckets, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fascinating area to think about and set of questions. And I wouldn't be saying one thing would be better or worse for this country, but I think when you look at data and sort of the trajectory of how things have happened, there certainly have been important moments, in the development of the news media landscape, both in terms of regulation and in terms of the economics and the impact on that. When it comes to sort of, when you look at regulation, I mean, certainly there was one of the big shifts, if you think about it, occurred when we got to cable. And so suddenly you went to the 24-hour, right? And you always needed to have something to say. And to fill in that time, there was more talk, right? There was more conversation, more talk. And then you started to have these sort of commentary shows or opinion shows and the talk shows that would come in. And a lot of that was built around needing to fill this 24 hours. And then you got, and then you had the digital online landscape come in, and you had a web. And so it was not only 24 hours, but there was endless amounts of space. You could produce as much content as you wanted. And then people began to expect this constant update. So not only did you break up sort of the package of news, as you well know, Sewell, I'm sure, but as not only did you break up the way news was packaged and sort of sit down and have my intake for the day over this hour, but you also got this sense of needing to constantly update. So you also broke up the individual story into bite-sized nuggets of updates. And that continued. And then once you moved to social media, friends, family, anybody became both the producer and a sender of news. And so you became even more removed from that potential news process. And so that wasn't so much around kind of that's regulation, but just in the way technology developed and how people's interaction with news really changed dramatically. And we have found that, like, when we'll ask about news, particularly if social media is included in the realm that we're asking about, we say news that goes beyond your friends and family, right? So you find that you need to say, I don't mean the reunion that your high school is sponsoring, we mean sort of different types of things. And so that's a part of it. Talk radio, which there's been a lot of conversation around, with the passing of Rush Limbaugh, who was such a powerhouse in that space. The change of regulation there certainly opened up a lot of conversation because you didn't have to have the other side.
And you're referring, do you want to just explain for our audience the fairness doctrine and what happened to it?
Sure, there was, and I am not an expert on it, so I will do a very cursory, but there we had what was called the fairness doctrine, and so you had to give equal time to the other view if you were airing, because you were getting airspace to be able to put your programming out, and so to receive that.
For broadcasters.
Yeah, right. But so then you had to be able to give sort of equal time. That went away, and suddenly people didn't have to give equal time, which really opened up the conversation. So there's certainly the structure of both technology and the flow of information and access carries a lot of weight in people's relationship to the news. Now, what that should be is for others to figure out, but certainly those impacts together. And one of the challenges news organizations face as they have lost so much of their revenue over the last decade, and particularly the newspaper industry, which has tended to be hit the hardest, is if you're seeking to make that connection and you're seeking to figure out how you do that, you're down to 2 reporters, and you're down to, so you're racing after this minute by minute news cycle with more going on, with more space to fill. You've got fewer reporters, and you're trying to figure out how to connect to your audience. So it all sort of builds challenge on challenge on challenge.
Yeah, I've lived these challenges for 20 years, and the way you put it together is very, very compelling. I'm going to ask just a couple more questions, and then we'll move to a fascinating group of questions already being posed by the participants. Amy, and this is perhaps my parochial interest, but having worked on both the news and opinion sides of American journalism, for me, the labeling is very important. Labeling things as news versus opinion is incredibly significant, I think. Do you think we in the media have done a poor job of establishing and enforcing that distinction?
Well, again, it's not my view that would matter here. I think there are, there have been some changes that organizations have made recently, national organizations, in trying to really be very explicit in those labels. And we have seen in past research that the public can have a hard time differentiating, factual statements from opinions in the news. We did a whole study that looked at exactly that, where we showed people, a mix of different statements. And asked people to say whether they were a fact-based statement, or an opinion statement. And, people got very confused, and, most got sort of 3 out of 5 right, but it's kind of like a chance, if you're rolling the dice. So I think the public can struggle with that. And some of the indicators of struggling, and especially in the digital realm, was tied to, their sort of digital savviness, as well as sort of their political awareness, or sort of how closely they're paying attention to things, as well as their digital savviness. The, social media structure can make that even harder, because everything is at least up until now, has looked pretty much the same. And again, some of these technology companies are working to make some visual differentiations. But that can make it harder for the public to be able to figure out what's what.
So as part of this, what is this largely connected to the levels of education and the quality of the education? Did you argued so convincingly that partisanship seems to be such a more important factor than other variables, including regional, et cetera. But is education a big part of this? Should there be much more emphasis on teaching news literacy and media literacy to young people and to adult citizens? You know, should there be an emphasis on, you know, how to distinguish between news and opinion, how to determine whether secondary sources are valid or not, how to assess different sources of information and judge their validity?
Well, it's interesting. So I would say that the points about the digital savviness being a factor of knowing of being able to differentiate fact from opinion, it does not negate the partisan divides. And so in that same study, you know, what we saw was that each party, members on each side of the political aisle, were more likely to call what they agreed with a fact and what they disagreed with opinion, right? So that totally still came through. We just had sort of, here are 4 areas where we see a big difference, and one of those was digital savviness. Partisanship certainly still showed a difference there. And where people are turning, I mean, the difference there is just that it is, when you're turning to different outlets, if you're hearing about different things, your sense of just reality and what you're exposed to may be very different as well. You know, that's part of what we were exploring in this past study too. And so there's attitudinal, and there's also the content you see. You know, what do I come across? What do I hear? You know, day after day. And then that, you know, what people did show in that particular study to be more likely to believe in as factual things that that went with their party's line of thinking.
So how much should we blame the algorithms and the platforms? And I ask that because I'm mindful of a whole bunch of debates going on right now. A number of Western democracies, France, UK, Canada, Australia, are considering financial or changes in either regulatory or financial you know, pressure on Facebook and Google to kind of share more revenue with publishers. That's obviously on the financial side, but there's also an element of it of recognizing that these platforms have become so powerful in terms of, you know, sending consumers down kind of rabbit holes. I mean, it's one thing to buy a certain publication or tune into a certain channel because you think it will support your existing worldviews. But now it's gotten even more intense because the articles you share and the articles to which you are exposed, especially if you come in through search or social, are also reinforcing that. You know, is there a role for government to play here in kind of regulating those algorithms?
Yeah, that's really outside my area of expertise, or, you know, what I am able to speak to be perfectly honest. There's certainly a number of factors that end up influencing what somebody sees, what they hear, and what they end up believing. And so, you know, there's a lot that makes this whole equation, if you want to call it that, about somebody's news environment really, really complicated today. And it also gets very complicated when it suddenly becomes international, because, you know, laws of a country can be different. And certainly here in the U.S., we've had a very strong sense of the wanting to protect the freedom of speech and freedom of information. And so it's a really complicated picture.
Finally, before we move to the audience questions, how, Amy, do you try to ensure that you get a healthy and balanced news diet from a variety of sources and a variety of perspectives?
Well, I mean, you know, I go to a lot of different places every day, and we check in on it, and we, you know, even as a part of our research, you know, have staff that are, you know, being sure that we're keeping tuned into a lot of different ways. The biggest thing is variety. Change it up, you know, go somewhere different tomorrow.
Yep. Fascinating. I'd like to now turn to some of the questions we have from our participants. Hold on one second. I am, okay, looking, sorry, let me just look up here. So I want to just try to go in order if possible. Dr. Newton Campbell asks, with the large number of available news sources, it's become absurdly difficult, even for savvy web surfers, to track down the source data, the primary source data for any particular story. For example, if something extreme has been said during congressional testimony, search engines will produce several pages of news articles before actually getting to the video or transcript of the testimony itself. And I would add much less get to the underlying truth of that testimony, which is yet another. You're not a search engine CEO, but from the media standpoint, what can be done to guide users more quickly to the original source material behind stories? Is that something the media would even want general readers to be able to quickly access?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, you know, and Sewell, you may have some interesting thoughts on this too, in terms of what the LA Times, you know, what you're doing at the LA Times. So I certainly welcome you to share your insights on that as a somebody who's practicing it. I do think that you know, there are ways to link digitally, which can be helpful, can also be confusing. It can depend on how links are set up, right? If it's just something embedded and it's hard to know, well, what is this going to take me to? You might hesitate to click on it. You know, transparency, easy ways of organizing content so that people can find it, you know, is all, I think, helpful to the user from that standpoint. You know, I'm curious if there are steps that at the LA Times that you're doing to look to sort of how do we help the reader or the viewer be able to find that original document and understand, you know, what may be the facts behind it.
Yeah, the main thing I would say, and it's the major tactic I usually advocate for the journalists I supervise and for my own writing, is really the most old-fashioned, which is link. I find sources more credible when the factual assertion, the statistic, the empirical finding links to a PDF, a government data set, a web page, you know, so that it's not merely us asserting. You know, you can see for yourself when we're saying, you know, unemployment's rising, or, you know, even to really kind of create a more healthy news ecosystem, I think we need to link to credible sources. I think that's one of the things we try to do. I always say this to our journalists, that you need to put, you know, in the story, the PDF, the report, the data set you're looking at, help establish credibility, reestablish credibility in empiricism itself. A question from Olivier Kamanda. In 2019, the Knight Foundation published research showing that 46% of American adults claim to have firm political views that rarely change. To what extent does the media have a role in lowering that percentage? Or should this be taken as the new normal?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that journalists would see it as their job to affect somebody's political thinking. I think that, you know, if you were to be looking at sort of the principles of journalism, which is something we worked on a long time ago, you know, that's around sort of being able to inform the public, you know, about, you know, the facts of the day, and that the onus that's on the journalist is to be able to bring all perspective and sides. And it often doesn't mean two, it can mean 3 or 4 or 6 perspectives to a story, but to be sure that that full story is there, and then somebody can form their views, or, you know, form their views and their sense of democracy around that.
Yeah, I'm really if you don't mind my sharing my perspective on this, I'm quite a traditionalist. I mean, I oversee an opinion section and we take institutional standpoints, but those standpoints aren't intended to dictate the ideology of our readers. The standpoints are usually very specific. How should we think about this property tax proposal? Or, you know, and they're really designed to help inform the citizenry. You know, I'd be very frightened, frankly, if we saw it as our goal to kind of you know, shift the ideological composition. It is really, really tough. I'm going to be frank. I ran after the election, recognizing that 6 million people in California voted for Donald Trump, and this is supposedly a very, very blue state, right? I published a full page of letters from our readers who voted for Trump. We fact-checked the letters carefully. We made sure there were no false assertions or claims. I simply wanted to hear from our readers, a minority of them, who voted for Trump. And I got so much criticism from from liberal readers, who are probably the majority of our readers, saying, you are doing a lot of damage here by platforming or giving voice to these Trump voters. They've condoned something unconscionable, and by giving them a platform, you're now lending legitimacy or respectability to something that's unacceptable. It was painful, but it was a very, very interesting experience for me to kind of see see how polarized we've become. Mokhtar Gawad asks, I'm a former journalist and worked most of my career in Europe. I've never seen a country as divided as the US is. So I think the media are just a projection of that, but can we make a difference between the print press, which is doing, which sometimes attempts to do a more fair and impartial coverage, from TV? And Mukhtar asks, are TV channels really the problem?
Yeah, well, when we look at audience, if you go back to that continuum line, and you look at sort of the audience makeup, there's a lot of audience separation among what are your traditionally print-based outlets that are now very digital. So, in terms of audience segmentation, that tends to be occurring, I think, in nearly all spaces.
Journalist Ricky Bevington asks, do you have any research about the public's understanding of media ownership and the connection between who owns a source and the potential bias in or quality of the information that source provides?
Yeah, that's interesting. We years and years ago sort of did some research on specifically on ownership and brands, and we've not redone that in the last few years, but we did ask in some of our questions exploring trust and people's sensibility, and there's definitely a large sense of skepticism expressed when it came to the ownership and the desires of the ownership. And so when we asked sort of about, is it the journalists doing the work or those that are, the owners? And there was certainly more sense that it was sort of an ownership area is where conflict, quote unquote bias, those types of things were stemming from. So again, that sense of and perhaps being part of that dark space and, I don't understand it. But there was greater skepticism that emerged when you asked about the ownership structure and the owners versus the journalists themselves.
Very interesting. Sorry, going for a little bit out of order here, but Tom Quirk asked a question early on that's very interesting. He asked, you're using, in your research, you're using the word distrust perhaps a bit negatively. Could distrust simply mean a questioning or skeptical attitude toward information as opposed to a more active mistrust or distrust?
That's a good question. I think in this sense, the way we're asking it was specifically distrust. I think that what you're speaking of maybe is that healthy skepticism. Like, I need to make sure I check some of this out myself, that I look at what the sources are, that I, look at all those other things that we were talking about just a minute ago. This set of questions started with trust and then distrust, and it was a neither trust nor distrust. So, that was another option. And for some of these outlets, a significant number of people would choose that neither option. So it did specifically use the word distrust for that reason and that definition.
Tom also asks about cause and effect. Are these findings a reflection of, a kind of natural tendencies in the citizenry, and the media merely reflects these market and conditions, or are the media themselves driving polarization?
I'm not sure that, the data could say sort of the chicken or egg, right? I mean, you have certain news outlets that emerge to counter, as they would say, we're here to counter the work of whatever, that we don't think is doing what it should be doing. And so there's dynamic at play. I don't know that I could, say that data would say, whether one comes before the other. Would certainly say the political divides and that political polarization manifests itself in a lot of different areas. And this is, sort of one of the other you know, some of my colleagues have been doing a lot of research in this space, and we've been seeing this again be emerging for years. You know, when we did that 2014 study, they were also doing a number of other areas of where are we seeing this political polarization emerge. And it's everything from, you know, would you marry somebody from the other party? Would you let your child marry somebody from the other? Would you be in a neighborhood, go to a school? You know, all those sorts of things are affecting life, so that the political element of divide here and separation is very strong and seen in a number of areas of life.
John Gallagher asks, has there been research about those who choose to pursue careers in journalism? With polarization having increased for several decades now, are journalists today more inclined to practice their craft in a politically activist manner, thereby contributing to the distrust?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, is this affecting who enters journalism and why they're entering it?
Yeah, you know, again, I don't know. There are some surveys. There is a survey that was done, at least used to be done yearly, of sort of, you know, recently graduating, journalism grads, recently graduated journalism grad students, about the professions they were going into, and there was a decline at one point. I'm not, to be perfectly honest, I have to say I'm not sure where those numbers stand right now. I do think, you know, the economic figures may have as much to do as anything with, you know, where people are looking for career choices, you know, and the ability of organizations to hire.
Yeah, maybe I could offer an observation. I do think I'm seeing some generational changes in folks' motivations about entering journalism. Journalism has, of course, you know, it was never well paid to begin with, but has been increasingly precarious. So we're seeing a lot of younger journalists who are very active, for example, in the labor movement. And we're seeing a lot of younger journalists who want media that are more, have a stronger point of view, are more authentic, are more kind of morally charged. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily about activism, but I do think that there are profound questions going on about, for example, objectivity and what that means. You know, again, I veer toward the traditionalist. I think I'm primarily a journalist because I want to chronicle, document, bear witness to, reveal, observe the complex world around us, rather than be a participant in that world politically. But it's not necessarily such an easy binary. A lot of younger journalists are asking, well, what about the historic failures of our industry to reflect communities of color, to reflect low-income folks, not enough socioeconomic diversity in our field? And I think that that's a powerful critique. There's also a critique about not having sufficient ideological diversity, you know, in our field. Are we doing enough to train and recruit journalists from rural backgrounds who are observant Christians, who may come from more politically conservative communities? So there's a lot that it could almost be a whole separate hour, but I do think that there are some of these profound questions right now of, you know, what we do and why we do it. And many of them are really, really legitimate debates. This has been such a rich discussion, Amy. I think, unfortunately, we're kind of running out of time because we want to keep this to an hour. But, barring any remaining questions, I just really wanted to, thank you for being so clear and rigorous in sharing these findings with us, and also to ask if you have any kind of concluding comments or thoughts that you'd like us to think about and engage with.
And just to thank you all, thank you for your time. I know it's always a decision to join another video, anything these days, so thank you for joining us. We look forward to continuing to do our research, dig into areas and new developments, and to gain understanding of the ways people are being informed today and in the future.
And I would just conclude by thanking you, Amy, again, the French American Foundation staff, and also to urge everyone to follow Pew Journalism on Twitter, PEW Journalism. It's a really rich source of information, data, empiricism, reliable information about trends in the press and politics.
Thank you so much.